The pregnant mare was supposed to die that morning. The farmer had already decided she was useless. What he didn't expect was a 63-year-old widow climbing his fence before sunrise. But saving her life wasn't the shocking part. What happened 5 days later changed everything. Before I tell you what happened 5 days later, I need to ask you something. If you heard an animal screaming in the dark, on land that wasn't yours, would you step in, or would you tell yourself it wasn't your problem? Because that decision is the reason this story exists. Comment below where you're watching from. And tell me honestly, do you think one person can really change the fate of something that isn't theirs? Stay with me, because what happened next, no one saw coming. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a farm in early November, just before the first hard frost locks everything into stillness. The fields go grey, the tree lines thin, and the sounds that remain, a distant crow, the creak of a weathered barn door, the soft exhale of livestock, feel amplified, like the land itself is listening. Mabel Greer had heard that silence every morning of her 63 years. She had been born in the farmhouse at the end of Old Sycamore Road, in a rural pocket of central Tennessee that most maps barely bothered to name. She had grown up there, fallen in love there, raised a son there, and buried her husband there. The land wasn't just where she lived, it was the architecture of everything she had ever been. People in town called her the Widow Greer now. Not unkindly, that was simply how the small world of Callaway Creek organized itself. You were who you had been next to, and who you were now that they were gone. Her husband Orrin had died 4 years earlier of a heart attack he apparently never saw coming, though Mabel would later say she had seen it in the way he moved through his last summer. Slower, heavier, like a man quietly making peace with something. She hadn't been wrong. She rarely was. She was not a woman who inspired pity. She was 5 feet 4 inches of deliberate motion, with hands that could fix a fence post and bake a pie in the same afternoon, and silver hair she kept braided without ceremony. Her son, Conrad, lived up in Nashville with his wife and their 2 little girls, and he called every Sunday without fail. She had neighbors she trusted, a church she attended with honest devotion, and a small black dog named Biscuit who considered himself her personal security detail. What she also had, and this mattered more than people understood, was a fierce, instinctive attention to suffering. She noticed it the way some people notice weather, not because she had been trained to, but because something in her had always been wired that way. She couldn't pass a stray without stopping. She couldn't hear an animal in distress without her whole body orienting toward it like a compass needle. That attention was about to be tested in a way she had never imagined. The property adjacent to hers on the eastern side had changed hands twice in the last decade. For most of that time, it had sat half-managed, the fences sagging, the outbuildings shedding paint. Then, about 18 months before this story takes place, a man named Doyle Pruitt moved in. Mabel hadn't liked him from the first week. She was not a woman who formed hasty opinions. She had learned long ago that first impressions were useful data, but not final verdicts. But Doyle Pruitt was one of those people whose cruelty wasn't hidden. It was casual. It lived on the surface of him, in the way he spoke to his dogs, in the way he handled his truck, in the sound, and this she had heard more than once through the tree line, of his voice when something on his property wasn't behaving the way he wanted. He had 3 horses, 2 older geldings he basically ignored, and a bay mare he had acquired sometime the previous spring. Her name, Mabel would eventually learn, was Della. She was a Tennessee walking horse with a deep reddish-brown coat and a white blaze that ran straight down the center of her face like a brushstroke. She was also, by the time November arrived, visibly, heavily pregnant. Mabel had seen the mare from the fence line several times over the summer. She had noticed the animal's condition. She had felt each time a quiet worry she couldn't quite name, the kind you push down because you tell yourself it isn't your business, it isn't your land, and there are laws and lines between neighbors for a reason. But something was changing. The mare's condition wasn't being managed. She had lost weight even as her belly grew, and Doyle Pruitt, from what Mabel could observe, had no idea or no interest in what a pregnant mare in the final trimester actually needed. On the morning of November 7th, Mabel woke at 5:15, as she always did, and stood at her kitchen window with her coffee, looking out at the frost that had come overnight. Biscuit was pressing his nose against the glass beside her, and then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the grey calm of that morning. High, broken, desperate. Not quite a scream. Horses don't scream the way people imagine, but something in the range of it. Something that went straight through the warmth of her kitchen and landed cold in the center of her chest. She set down her mug before she had made a conscious decision to move. She pulled on her barn coat over her pajamas, stepped into her rubber boots, and was across the frost-stiffened grass of her yard in under 2 minutes. Biscuit followed, then stopped at the fence line, ears flat, instinct apparently telling him that whatever was on the other side of those boards was not something he should approach. Mabel didn't stop. The eastern fence between her property and Doyle Pruitt's had a place near the old oak where 2 boards had rotted and never been replaced. She had never used it before. She used it now, stepping through sideways and moving into the neighboring land with the focused calm of someone who had decided the situation had passed the point where property lines were the most important thing. What she found in the far paddock stopped her breath. Della was down on her side in the mud near the water trough, not resting. There was nothing restful about it. Her legs were moving in short, desperate kicks, and the sounds she was making were low and rhythmic and wrong. The ground around her was torn where she had struggled. Her eyes were wide and showing white at the edges, and Doyle Pruitt was standing 10 feet away. He wasn't calling a vet. He wasn't trying to help her up. He was standing there with a length of rope in one hand and an expression on his face that Mabel could only describe later as impatient, as if the animal's distress was a personal inconvenience. As she watched, frozen for just a moment at the edge of the paddock, he stepped forward and struck the mare across the flank with the rope. Not hard enough to leave a mark, maybe, but hard enough. Mabel moved. "Stop!" Her voice came out of her like something load-bearing, not loud, just final. Doyle turned. He was a broad man in his mid-50s, with a thick neck and the particular kind of expression people wear when they are surprised to be interrupted in something they assumed was private. "This is my property," he said. "I know whose property it is," Mabel said, stepping into the paddock without breaking her stride. "And I'm telling you to stop." She went directly to the mare's head, knelt in the mud without a thought about her pajamas or her coat, placed both hands on the animal's neck, below the jaw, where the pulse runs close to the surface. Della's breathing was fast and shallow. Her muscles were trembling. "She's in labor," Mabel said, "or she's trying to be, and she's in trouble." "She'll figure it out," Doyle said. "Horses do this on their own. Healthy horses do," Mabel said. "She is not healthy." She looked up at him. "When did she last eat?" He didn't answer, which was its own answer. "I'm calling a veterinarian," Mabel said. She had her phone in the pocket of her barn coat. She always did, ever since Orrin died. "You can object or you can help. Those are your choices." "You have no right." "I have every human right," she said, and her voice was so steady that it seemed to rearrange the air between them. "You can call the sheriff if you want. Call him now. I'll wait. But I'm not leaving this animal until someone qualified is here." Doyle stared at her for a long moment. Then he spat to the side and walked back toward his house. Mabel called the large animal vet clinic in town, the on-call number. It rang 3 times before a woman answered with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been awake since before the sun. "This is Dr. Price," the voice said. "My name is Mabel Greer. I'm on Old Sycamore Road, East County. There's a pregnant mare down. She appears to be in distress labor. She's been underweight, and I believe she hasn't been fed properly. I need someone out here as fast as you can manage." A pause. Brief. Professional. "Is the owner present and consenting?" "The owner is currently sulking," Mabel said, "but he hasn't told me to leave. I'll handle the consent when you arrive." Another pause. Then, "I'll be there in 40 minutes." Mabel stayed on the ground with Della. She kept her hands moving, slow, deliberate pressure along the mare's neck and shoulder, the kind of contact that isn't pretending to be medical but is simply one creature telling another, "I am here. You are not alone." She talked quietly. About nothing in particular. About the frost and the morning and the way the light was starting to come up over the eastern tree line in thin orange lines. The mare's breathing slowed, just slightly. Not because anything had been fixed, but perhaps because the quality of the space around her had changed. Conrad called at 6:15, slightly early for a Sunday, as if something had told him to. Mabel answered with one hand, keeping the other on Della's neck. "Mom, you okay?" "I'm in a paddock," she said. A pause. "Okay," he said, and the word held the particular acceptance of a man who had grown up knowing his mother was the kind of person who ended up in paddocks. "Do you need anything?" "Not yet," she said. "I'll call you later." Dr. Price arrived in 38 minutes. Her full name was Dr. Nadia Price, and she was younger than Mabel had expected, late 30s, maybe 40, with close-cropped natural hair and eyes that moved over the scene with the swift, cataloguing efficiency of someone who had learned to assess fast, because fast sometimes mattered. She had a large animal kit in the back of her truck, and she was pulling on examination gloves before the engine had finished ticking. She went to the mare without preamble, knelt beside Mabel, put her hands on Della in a completely different way, purposeful, diagnostic, and within 90 seconds she was looking up with an expression that was calm, in the way that professionals are calm when they need you not to panic. "She's been in early labor for a while," Dr. Price said. "The foal is positioned wrong. Not catastrophically, I've seen worse, but she can't do this without help." She looked at Mabel. "You're not the owner." "No." "Where is he?" "In the house." Dr. Price's jaw tightened slightly. "I'm going to need his permission, or I'm going to need to get animal control involved before I can proceed with intervention. Either works for me, but we need to move." "Give me 5 minutes," Mabel said. She walked to the house, knocked. Doyle opened the door with a coffee mug in hand, and the expression of someone who had decided to be difficult. Mabel didn't give him the chance. "The vet is here," she said. "The foal is in the wrong position. If she doesn't intervene, you will lose the mare and the foal both. That's her medical opinion. I'd like you to give permission. If you don't, I'm going to call animal control right now and report what I witnessed this morning, and you can handle whatever comes from that. Your choice." The silence between them lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "Fine," he said. She walked back to the paddock. Dr. Price worked with an economy of motion that Mabel found almost beautiful to watch. The way a person looks when they have done something so many times that the anxiety has been replaced entirely by competence. She administered an epidural analgesic to reduce the mare's involuntary straining, repositioned the foal with her hands and a foaling strap, and talked through every step in a low, steady voice. Not to Mabel exactly, but not to herself either. Just into the space, the way surgeons sometimes narrate to keep their own concentration taut. Mabel stayed at Della's head, kept both hands in contact, kept talking. At 7:43 in the morning, in the frozen mud of a poorly maintained paddock on the edge of Callaway Creek, Tennessee, a foal was born. He came out in a rush of fluid and stillness that always seems, in that first impossible second, like something has gone wrong. And then the foal's chest moved, and he shook his head, and the sound he made was so small and new that Mabel felt something give way somewhere in the middle of her. Dr. Price cleared the membranes from his face. He was a colt, dun-colored, a warm sandy gold with dark legs and a faint dorsal stripe running down his back. He was small, as foals go, but his limbs were straight, and his eyes, when they opened, were clear and dark and already trying to make sense of a world he had just arrived in. Della lifted her head for the first time since Mabel had arrived. She turned toward the sound of him, and the sound she made, low, throaty, something between breath and voice, was so specifically tender that Dr. Price, who had assisted in hundreds of births, pressed her lips together and looked briefly at the middle distance. "He's okay?" Mabel asked. "He's small," Dr. Price said, "but he's okay." She began writing in her report. I'm going to need to document this entire situation, the mare's condition, what I observed, the circumstances. You understand that? I was counting on it, Mabel said. What followed over the next 72 hours was the kind of quiet war that happens when one person has decided to be inconvenient to another person's cruelty, and the cruelty doesn't have quite enough confidence in itself to push back hard. Doyle Pruitt mostly stayed inside. He came out twice, both times clearly expecting Mabel to have left. Both times he found her still there, either at the fence line or in the paddock itself, and he retreated without confrontation. There was something in the way she occupied space that seemed to take the air out of his certainty. She went home each evening, fed biscuit, ate something, slept a few hours, was back before dawn. Dr. Price returned each morning. She filed her veterinary welfare report on day 1. By day 2, it had been formally reviewed by the county's animal welfare officer, a methodical man named Ray Tatum, who had done the job for 11 years and who told Mabel when he arrived on the second afternoon that he had been waiting for a complaint on this property. He's been on our radar, Ray said. He was writing something on his clipboard, not looking up. 2 prior complaints. Dogs, 3 years back. Nothing that rose to the level of seizure. Does this rise to that level? Mabel asked. He looked at her for a moment. Dr. Price's report does, he said. Yes. Conrad arrived on the second day. He drove 3 hours from Nashville after Mabel's Sunday call, which had apparently not sounded as casual as she intended. He was 41, lean and serious, with orange eyes, and he stood at the paddock fence for a long time, looking at Della and the colt without saying anything. Mom, he finally said. I know, she said. You've been here for 2 days. I'm aware. Is this... He stopped, started again. Is this about Dad? The question surprised her. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. Maybe some of it, she said. You can't watch something helpless suffer and not remember every time you couldn't do anything. And then you find a moment when you can do something and... She paused. It's not complicated, Conrad. He was quiet for a while. What do you need? I need Doyle Pruitt to not own this animal anymore, she said simply. The legal mechanism, Ray Tatum explained, was more specific than simply transferring ownership because a neighbor had decided she objected. There would need to be a formal hearing. Documentation of neglect would need to meet a statutory threshold. It could take weeks, possibly months. Meanwhile, he said, he could place the animals on a welfare watch, meaning scheduled check-ins and documentation of conditions. It wasn't removal, but it was presence. It was scrutiny. And scrutiny, Mabel told Conrad that evening, sitting on her porch with tea and the sound of November crickets making their last determined stand before the cold, is remarkably effective with people who are cowards. She didn't say it with pleasure. She said it with the same even tone she used for everything, an observation, not a triumph, but she was right, and she knew it. On the third morning, something shifted. His name was Fletcher Obie, and he was Doyle Pruitt's nephew, which meant the situation was about to acquire a layer of complexity that Mabel had not anticipated. Fletcher was 26, recently returned from 4 years in the army, and was living temporarily in his uncle's spare room while he figured out what came next. He was quiet in the way people are quiet when they have seen things they are still organizing. He had a directness that Mabel found she trusted immediately, which surprised her given the family connection. He came to her fence on the third morning. He didn't announce himself, just stood there until she noticed him, which she did quickly because she noticed everything. "Mom," he said, "I'm Fletcher, Doyle's nephew." "I know who you are," she said. "I've seen you a few times. I want to tell you something." He was holding his hat with both hands in the practiced awkward way of young men trying to convey sincerity. "I didn't know how bad it was. With the horse. I knew he was rough about it. That's just how he is about everything. But I didn't know she was..." He stopped, swallowed. "I should have looked closer. I'm sorry I didn't." Mabel regarded him for a moment. "Are you in a position to do anything about it?" she asked. Or are you telling me this because it makes you feel better? He blinked. Then, and she respected this, he almost smiled. That's a fair question, he said. Both, maybe, but also the first one. Fletcher, it turned out, had grown up with horses. His grandmother, Doyle's mother, had kept them on a property in East Tennessee. He knew what a healthy pregnant mare looked like and what a neglected one looked like. And the morning Dr. Price had arrived, he had watched from a distance and felt something crystallize. I've been trying to figure out how to leave anyway, he said. I've been waiting until I had a reason that felt real enough to act on. Mabel understood that kind of waiting. She had done it herself once or twice in her life, not for failure of courage exactly, but for the lack of a moment clear enough to step into. What are you proposing? She asked. What Fletcher proposed was this. He was willing to provide a written statement to the animal welfare officer about what he had observed during his months at the property, the feeding patterns, the condition of the mare, specific incidents he had witnessed. He was also willing to speak to his uncle directly about surrendering the horses voluntarily, which, he explained, was the kind of thing Doyle might actually agree to if it allowed him to frame the decision as his own, rather than something imposed on him. He has a lot of pride, Fletcher said. It was not said with affection, but it wasn't without complexity. Most people who do cruel things quietly do, Mabel said. She called Ray Tatum that afternoon. He came out within the hour, took Fletcher's statement at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and said quietly at the end that this changes things significantly. But it was what happened the following morning that changed everything else. She had learned to sleep lightly that week, not anxiously. Mabel didn't do anxiety the way most people did, as an ambient state, but with a particular alertness, the kind that comes from caring about something at a distance and knowing the distance is imperfect. She woke at 3:40 in the morning on the 5th day to a sound she couldn't immediately identify. Low and distant, but wrong in the way only certain sounds are wrong, the ones that contradict the specific silence they interrupt. She was at the fence in minutes. Biscuit was at her heels and then stopped again, as he had the first morning at exactly the same board. The paddock was dark. The half moon gave enough light to see shapes, not details, and for a moment she couldn't locate the source, and then she saw it. Della was on her feet, which was correct. The colt was on his feet, pressed against her, which was also correct. Both of them were oriented toward the far corner of the paddock, toward the gate that led to the secondary field. And the gate was open, not ajar, open wide. Mabel climbed the fence. She moved toward them slowly, not wanting to spook either animal in a direction she couldn't predict in the dark. The colt turned his head at her approach, and she held her breath. The unsteadiness of a 5-day-old in an unexpected situation was a real variable. But Della recognized her. She had made a habit, each visit, of bringing something in her pocket, a few sugar cubes, a piece of apple, and the mare associated her with that specific kindness now. Della let her close. Mabel got her hand on the mare's halter and stood there in the dark, breathing. Then she heard him, not Doyle. Doyle was bluster and resentment. She knew his emotional temperature by now. This was something different, something frightened and wrong and trying not to be heard. She turned slowly. In the shadow near the gate, hunched against the fence post with his hands in fists and his face doing something complicated, was a boy, not a man. A boy, maybe 15 or 16, with a thin frame and a hooded sweatshirt and the unmistakable energy of someone who had done something and was only now fully understanding what they had done. Mabel didn't move fast. She didn't raise her voice. "Hi," she said. The boy jerked, stared at her. "What's your name?" she asked. A long pause. "Denny," he said, his voice cracked on the single syllable. "Denny," she said. "Did you open that gate?" He said nothing, which meant yes. "Did you come to take the horse?" she asked, not accusingly, genuinely. "The foal," he said, and the way he said it, with a helpless kind of longing, told her the full story before he spoke another word. I heard about him. People at school were talking about the horse and the lady next door, and I thought, I don't know what I thought. I was just going to—" He stopped. "I don't know." Mabel looked at him for a long moment. He was shaking, and not entirely from the cold. "Whose son are you?" she asked. A pause. "Miss Winsome's," he said. "She lives up on Miller Creek Road." Mabel knew Wanda Winsome. She was a single mother who worked 2 jobs and who Mabel had sat behind in church for years without ever knowing her well. She had a boy, she now recalled. The boy was named Dennis, but everyone called him Denny. "Come here," she said. He hesitated. Then, with the exhausted obedience of someone whose defenses have completely run out, he came. She handed him the end of Della's lead rope. "Hold this," she said. He took it, and something happened in the way he took it. The hands that had been fists opened, and his face changed, and he looked at the mare with an expression so raw and unguarded that Mabel felt again that thing giving way inside her. "She's beautiful," he said, quietly, as if he had never said that word before and was surprised to hear himself say it. "She is," Mabel agreed. They stood there together in the dark for a moment that had no official place in anyone's plan. Then Mabel said, "Denny, I need you to understand that taking someone's animal, even an animal that's being mistreated, is not the right path. Not because the animal doesn't deserve better, but because it puts you in the wrong, and it makes it harder for the people trying to help through the right channels." He nodded. He was still looking at Della. "But I also need you to understand something else," she said. "The fact that you came here in the middle of the night because you heard a foal was born to a mistreated mare and you wanted to help, that's not something to be ashamed of. That's actually something remarkable." He looked at her. His eyes were wet. He was trying not to let them be. "Are you in trouble?" she asked. "For what?" "I mean generally," she said. "Are you doing okay?" A pause that said everything. "Not really," he said. "Okay," she said. "We're going to close that gate and we're going to get you home. And tomorrow I'm going to call your mother and we're going to talk. All right?" He stared at her. "You're not going to call the sheriff?" "No," she said. "Why not?" She took the lead rope back from him gently. "Because you didn't take anything. You opened a gate and then you stood in a field in the cold at 4 a.m. with your hands in fists, trying to figure out what to do. That's not a crime. That's a kid who needed something to care about." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to punish you for that." She could hear him trying to hold himself together. The sounds he made were the sounds of someone losing that particular effort. She didn't tell him not to cry. She just stood there, the mare warm between them, the colt pressing close to his mother's side, the November dark surrounding all of it like something held. After a while, when Denny had quieted, she walked him to her truck and drove him home. She left a note in the mailbox for Wanda and drove back and closed the paddock gate securely and stood in her yard for a long time, watching the first grey suggestion of dawn build in the east. Biscuit sat on her foot. She reached down and scratched his ear. "I know," she said to him. He leaned against her ankle and didn't say anything, which was the right response. The formal hearing on the welfare case for Doyle Pruitt's horses was scheduled for the last week of November. It was not, in the end, a dramatic proceeding. The documentation was thorough. Dr. Price's veterinary assessment, Ray Tatum's welfare officer report, Fletcher's written statement, photographs taken over the 5 days of official observation. Doyle Pruitt appeared with a lawyer who seemed to privately share Ray Tatum's assessment of the situation because his advice to his client appeared to be, accept the voluntary surrender and make this stop. Doyle surrendered the horses on November 22nd. He did not look at the mare or the colt as they were loaded. He stood with his arms crossed and his face arranged into an expression of profound inconvenience, and then he went inside, and that was essentially the last significant contact Mabel had with him. He sold the property 6 weeks later and left the county. She never learned where he went, and she never tried to find out. Dr. Price coordinated the placement. The 2 older geldings went to a retirement sanctuary north of Nashville. Della and her colt, the question of his name had not yet been formally resolved, were placed in temporary care with a horse rescue organization 40 minutes from Callaway Creek, while their long-term situation was determined. Mabel visited every 4 days. Conrad came with her twice. The second time, he stood at the fence watching the colt run, and by 6 weeks he was running, with the exuberant, complete commitment style of a young horse who has no sense of his own size relative to the world. And Conrad said quietly, "Dad would have loved this." "I know," Mabel said. She called Wanda Winsome the day after the night in the paddock, as she had promised. The conversation was initially careful, the wariness of a woman who has learned to expect judgment. But Mabel wasn't calling to judge. She told Wanda what Denny had done, without embellishment and without accusation. She told her what she had seen in him. She told her she thought he was a good kid in need of something specific that she might be able to help with if Wanda was open to it. Wanda was quiet for a long time. Then she said, in a voice that was trying very hard, "He doesn't have a lot of people in his corner right now." "Well," Mabel said, "he does now." By February, a decision had been finalized. Mabel Greer had submitted a formal application to adopt Della and her colt through the rescue organization. The application process had involved a property inspection, a financial review, references from Dr. Price and Ray Tatum, and a very long phone conversation with the rescue coordinator, a woman named Frances Dodd, who asked questions with the thoroughness of someone who had been burned before and had decided to be unreservedly careful from that point forward. Mabel had answered every question, including the honest one which Frances eventually asked, "Why do you want them?" Mabel had thought about that for a moment. "Because I was there," she said, "and being there changes things. I don't think I'm supposed to just walk away from what it changed." Frances had been quiet. "That's one of the better answers I've gotten," she said. The adoption was approved in the first week of February. Della and the colt came home on a Saturday morning that was cold but bright, the kind of winter day that makes promises it can't quite keep, but is beautiful anyway. Conrad was there with his wife, Tamara, and their 2 daughters, who stood at the fence with wide eyes, and one of them, the younger one, Bee, who was 5, reached through the rails immediately and confidently and touched the colt's nose with 2 fingers, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The colt let her. Then he backed up 2 steps and looked at her with the evaluating expression horses wear when they are deciding whether a thing is worth continued investigation. He stepped forward again. "He likes me," Bee said. "He does," Mabel agreed. The colt's name, it had been decided, was Ember. Mabel had thought about it for several weeks before settling. Ember for the particular color of him in afternoon light. That warm dun with the dark edge, like something just on the far side of fire. Ember for what survives when the burning is done. Denny came to meet them on that same Saturday. He arrived on his bicycle, slightly out of breath, and stood at the pasture gate with his hands in his pockets and an expression of carefully managed casualness that did not succeed at concealing his emotion in the slightest. He had been coming to Mabel's farm every Saturday for 2 months by then. She had taught him basic horse care, using reference materials and a handbook Dr. Price had lent her, feeding schedules, grooming, what to watch for. She was not trying to create anything elaborate. She was simply giving him somewhere to be on Saturday mornings that had a clear purpose and no expectations beyond showing up and paying attention. His grades had improved. Wanda had told her this with the particular combination of relief and bewilderment of a parent who does not fully understand what has happened, but is deeply grateful for it. "He found something to care about," Mabel had said. "He found someone who cared about him," Wanda said. She paused. "I think he needed to see that first." Standing at the fence that February Saturday, Denny watched Ember run his first full lap of his new pasture, head up, tail flagging, hooves throwing up frozen clods, and the sound Denny made was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but something in the exact middle, the sound of pure, uncomplicated joy arriving in a person who had forgotten it was available to them. Fletcher Obie had moved to a small farm property in Middle Tennessee by then. He had sent Mabel a card. Not an email, a physical card with a stamp and everything, thanking her for what she had done and telling her he was working with a horse rescue organization closer to his new home. The card was in the woven basket on her kitchen counter where she kept things she wanted to keep. Dr. Nadia Price stopped by in February to check on Della and Ember, professionally and also, it seemed, because she wanted to. She stood in the pasture with her hands in her coat pockets and watched Ember approach the fence where B was still stationed and perform his now established ritual of investigation. "How's she eating?" she asked. "Everything I put in front of her," Mabel said. Dr. Price nodded. She was quiet for a moment, then, "I've been doing this for 12 years. I don't always get to see the ending." "Is this an ending?" Mabel asked. Dr. Price considered. "I think it's a beginning," she said. Mabel thought about that, about Oren, and about the particular silence of November, and about a mare down in the mud, and a boy standing in the dark with his hands in fists, and a colt who had arrived in the world in the wrong position and still arrived. About all the ways a life contains its own reversal if someone is paying attention. "Yes," she said, "I think it is. I told you this was going to stay with you. Because this story isn't really about a horse, even though the horse is the heart of it. It's about a woman who had every reason to look away, who was tired and grieving in the quiet way that doesn't announce itself, and minding her own business, and who heard one wrong sound on one cold morning and decided that being present was more important than being comfortable. It's about the way that decision rippled into a boy who needed someone to see him, into a young man who needed a reason to step into something better, into a veterinarian who doesn't always get endings, into two little girls at a fence rail with their whole lives ahead of them, and maybe into you sitting wherever you are, watching this. There is always a Della somewhere. There is always a moment when a sound reaches you through the distance and asks you to decide what kind of person you are. Most of those moments are small. Most of them don't become stories. But they are all, every single one of them, real. Mabel Greer is 63 years old, and she lives alone on Old Sycamore Road. And every morning she stands at her kitchen window with her coffee, and she looks out at her pasture, where a mare and her dun colt stand in whatever light the day has brought, and she thinks of her husband, and she thinks of the boy on his bicycle, and she thinks of the particular sound of that first cold morning. And she is not sad, she is grateful for the sound that woke her, for the boots she pulled on without thinking, for the fence she stepped through, for the chance, when it came, to be the someone who actually showed up. If this story moved you, leave a comment. Tell me where you watched it from. Tell me about a moment when you showed up for something, or when someone showed up for you. Those stories matter. Every single one. Like and subscribe if you want more. There are more. There are always more.